I want to begin with a statement that may sound hyperbolic, but I assure you it is grounded in data. We are witnessing the economic architecture of a state under extraordinary stress. Not from external conquest, not from natural disaster, but from internal contradictions that have been compounding for decades and are now reaching critical mass. Let me be direct. When 500,000 people take to the streets of Tel Aviv in a single day, when 1 million citizens protest simultaneously across a country of 10 million, when serving military pilots publicly denounce their government's strategy, when teenagers refuse conscription en masse, when the fiscal deficit approaches 7% of GDP, while debt grows by 9% in just 2 years, these are not merely protests about policy. These are symptoms of a social contract in the process of dissolution. Israel's situation presents us with a case study in how economic contradictions can transform into political crisis. And what makes this case particularly instructive is that we're not talking about a failing state with weak institutions. We're analyzing one of the world's most technologically advanced economies, home to more Nasdaq-listed companies than any country except the United States and China, with a per capita GDP that exceeds Britain, Germany, and Canada. Yet, this very success contains the seeds of its current crisis. Let me walk you through the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that political rhetoric cannot obscure. The immediate trigger, of course, is the war. The direct costs from October 2023 through 2024 exceeded $40 billion. To put that in perspective, that represents roughly 7% of Israel's GDP spent in 18 months. The 3-day operation against Iran alone cost $1.5 billion. That's nearly 1% of the annual government budget consumed in 72 hours. But here's what's critical to understand. These are only the direct costs. The Bank of Israel has calculated war-related costs through 2025 at $55.6 billion. These figures don't capture the full economic shock. Consumer spending dropped by 27%. Imports fell by 42%. Exports declined by 18%. In the second quarter of 2025, the economy contracted by 3.5% as the war with Iran disrupted normal business operations. Now, Israel entered this crisis from a position of relative fiscal strength. Before October 2023, its debt to GDP ratio was among the best in the industrialized world. Even today, at 69%, it remains better than the United States or the European Union, with the exception of Germany. This is important context. This is not a story of profligacy or fiscal mismanagement in the traditional sense. But, and this is crucial, you cannot grow your debt to GDP ratio by 9% over 2 years without consequence. You cannot allow interest and debt payments to consume an ever larger share of the budget without making choices. Difficult choices, politically explosive choices. The OECD projected 3.4% growth for 2025, 5.5% for 2026. The IMF is more pessimistic, 3.2 and 3.6%, respectively. But let me direct your attention to what happened in the second quarter of 2025, a 3.5% contraction. The gap between projection and reality should concern us all. Here's the fiscal reality. The deficit reached nearly 7% of GDP in 2024. It has narrowed to 5.3% as of February 2025, but this remains well above the government's own target of 4.9%. Tax revenues in February dropped by 38% compared to January. This volatility alone makes budget planning nearly impossible. The central bank expects a deficit of 4.7% and a debt to GDP ratio of 69% for 2025. But these projections assume no major escalation in hostilities, continued economic recovery, and successful fiscal consolidation. How many of those assumptions feel secure to you right now? Let me now turn to what I consider the deeper structural crisis, one that existed long before October 2023, but has been dramatically accelerated by current events. Israel has, in effect, two economies operating within a single state. This is not metaphorical. The data shows this with brutal clarity. The first economy is the high-tech sector, 9% of the workforce. World-leading venture capital investment as a percentage of GDP, extraordinary productivity, global competitiveness. In March 2025, Google acquired the Israeli cybersecurity company Wiz for $32 billion. In July, NVIDIA announced a multi-billion-dollar tech campus expansion. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange has risen by more than 80% since the war began. This economy is thriving. The second economy includes nearly everyone else. And here, the story is very different. Let's talk about the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredim. They currently represent about 10% of the population, but demographic projections show they will comprise 25% by 2050. The Arab-Israeli population is approximately 20% currently and growing. Here are the employment figures that should alarm any economist. Roughly half of ultra-Orthodox men do not work. They study in yeshivas, supported by state stipends, spousal income, and community charity. Among Arab women, labor force participation remains significantly below the national average. Now, you might say, this is a cultural choice, a matter of religious practice or tradition. And you would be correct. But economics doesn't care about our categories. Economics cares about inputs and outputs, productivity and dependency ratios, tax revenue and transfer payments. The Israel Democracy Institute has estimated a cumulative GDP loss of approximately 10%. By 2050, 160 billion shekels in 2023 terms, attributable to low, ultra-Orthodox workforce participation. That's 10% of economic output simply not being produced. The Bank of Israel's chief economist calculated that closing the employment gap in the ultra-Orthodox sector could add 0.6% to annual growth, representing a 22% increase in the baseline growth rate. But the inequality isn't just about employment. It's about burden sharing in the most literal sense. Haredi households pay 1/3 the income tax, national insurance, and health insurance payments that non-Haredi households pay, despite Haredi households being, on average, 1.5 times larger. The average non-Haredi household spends 4,496 shekels monthly on taxes and state payments. The average Haredi household spends 1,469 shekels. Among OECD countries, Israel ranks second only to the United States in disposable income inequality. 70% of Haredim and 57% of Arab Israelis live below the market income poverty line. Even after government transfers, 57% of Haredim and 50% of Arab Israelis remain below the poverty line. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not an indictment of any community. This is an observation about systemic sustainability. Because here's the mechanism that should concern us. In a democracy, when one segment of the population bears the overwhelming burden of both military service and tax revenue, while another segment is largely exempt from both, you create the conditions for social fracture. And when that exempt population is also the fastest growing demographic in the country, the mathematics become inexorable. By 2060, the ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations combined will constitute half of Israel's total population. Half. If current employment and workforce participation patterns persist, you're looking at a shrinking tax base trying to support an expanding dependent population while also funding the military requirements of a state in a hostile regional environment. The Bank of Israel has warned explicitly that these demographic trends will reduce market growth in coming decades. A separate finance ministry report used even starker language, warning of potential Greece-style bankruptcy if integration of ultra-Orthodox and Arab citizens into the workforce fails. Let me now connect this to the third pillar of the crisis, the cost of living, particularly housing. The average home price in Israel reached 2.23 million shekels, approximately $606,000, in the first quarter of 2025. In Tel Aviv, the average is 4.14 million shekels, roughly $1.2 million. These prices have nearly doubled in a decade. For rental markets, the situation is equally severe. In Tel Aviv, a modest three-room apartment now costs approximately 7,000 shekels per month, roughly $2,000, and this is at the lower end of the market. Young Israelis looking to purchase must come up with approximately 840,000 shekels in personal equity, covering down payment, closing costs, taxes, and fees. This represents years of savings for most workers outside the high-tech sector. The social protests of 2011 began with housing costs. Now, in 2025, those costs have exploded, while wages for most workers have not kept pace. Mortgage rates above 5%, combined with down payments requiring substantial cash, have pushed more and more Israelis into the rental market, which drives rents higher, which makes saving for a down payment even more difficult. It's a vicious cycle. The OECD has documented that life in Israel is expensive by developed world standards, with restrictive planning regulations and slow urban development driving up home prices. Product market regulations remain more stringent than in comparable economies, reducing competition and keeping consumer prices high. When the price of pasta sparked protests in 2022, when cottage cheese boycotts mobilized thousands in 2011, when the milky protest went viral in 2014 over chocolate pudding prices. These weren't trivial consumer complaints. They were expressions of a broader frustration with an economy that appears rigged against ordinary workers. Now, let me connect these three pillars: war costs, structural inequality, and cost of living to what we're seeing on the streets. In August 2025, 500,000 people marched in Tel Aviv. Organizers reported 1 million participants nationwide. This was not an isolated event. In March 2025, more than 100,000 protested across multiple cities. Throughout the summer, tens of thousands demonstrated repeatedly, blocking highways, surrounding government buildings, clashing with police. The scale matters, but so does the composition. These aren't marginal groups. University presidents attended protests. More than 1,000 current and former military pilots signed an open letter in April 2025, calling the war politically motivated rather than security-driven. These are the elite units, the tip of the spear, publicly questioning their government strategy. Military refusal is accelerating. There's been what organizers call an exponential increase of 16 and 17-year-olds refusing conscription. Roughly 100 circulated an open letter explaining their refusal. Reserve soldiers are increasingly vocal about poor strategy, unclear objectives, and excessive burden on a shrinking pool of those willing to serve. The government's response has been revealing. As of July 2024, 1,635 Israelis had been arrested since January 2023, with more than 700 arrests since the war began. A 2025 Shin Bet affidavit states that Netanyahu explicitly ordered surveillance of citizens involved in protests. The Violence Monitoring Organization reported 1,536 incidents of violence in 2024, with the majority attributed to police actions. When a government begins arresting hundreds of its own citizens for protest, when it orders domestic intelligence services to surveil demonstrators, when it uses water cannons and stun grenades on crowds waving national flags, these are not the actions of a government confident in its legitimacy. Here's what concerns me most as an economist: the feedback loops. Fiscal stress leads to austerity or tax increases, which increase cost of living, which fuels protests, which creates political instability, which reduces investment, which slows growth, which worsens the fiscal position, which requires more austerity or tax increases. This is the loop that has broken other countries. Demographic trends reduce the tax base while increasing dependency ratios, which stresses public finances, which requires either cutting benefits or raising taxes on working citizens, which increases resentment between communities, which hardens political positions, which makes reform more difficult, which ensures the demographic trends continue unchecked. Military burden becomes concentrated among a shrinking segment willing to serve, which increases the per capita cost of service, which fuels resentment, which increases refusal rates, which further concentrates the burden. Meanwhile, the communities exempt from service grow larger, making the political cost of changing the exemption higher. These are not problems that resolve themselves. These are problems that compound until something breaks. Let me address the obvious counter-argument. Israel has faced existential threats since its founding. It has fought multiple wars. It has absorbed waves of immigration. It has built a first world economy from scratch. Why should we believe this crisis is different? 3 reasons. First, the fiscal arithmetic has changed. Previous wars were shorter. The current situation is approaching 2 years of sustained high-intensity operations across multiple fronts, with no clear end state. The costs are not a one-time shock that can be absorbed and recovered from. They are ongoing, cumulative, and accelerating. Second, the demographic trends are unprecedented. In previous generations, the ultra-Orthodox community was small enough that their non-participation in the workforce and military was economically absorbable. By 2060, they will be 25% of the population. The mathematics of burden sharing become untenable at that scale. Third, and most importantly, the social contract is fraying in a way it hasn't before. Previous protest movements, 2011, 2023's judicial reform protests, eventually dissipated. The current protests are sustained, growing, and increasingly radical. When university presidents march, when elite military units openly dissent, when teenagers refuse conscription en masse, you're looking at the crisis of legitimacy, not just the crisis of policy. Let me give you a specific data point that crystallizes this. In polls conducted in 2025, a majority of Israelis opposed the end of the January ceasefire. A majority wanted negotiations to continue. Yet, the government returned to war. The disconnect between public preference and government action could not be clearer. When citizens believe their government is prosecuting a war, not for security, but for political survival, when they believe the lives of hostages are being sacrificed for coalition management, when they believe their economic future is being mortgaged to maintain power, this is not a governance problem. This is a legitimacy crisis. And legitimacy crises in democracies create revolutionary pressure. Now, I'm not predicting civil war in the conventional sense, armed factions fighting for territorial control. Israel's institutions remain strong, its security services capable, its civil society resilient, but civil war in a modern democracy doesn't look like Sarajevo in the 1990 seconds. It looks like a society that can no longer agree on basic facts, basic values, basic distribution of burdens and benefits. It looks like half the population believing the government is illegitimate, while the other half believes the protesters are traitors. It looks like communities that no longer speak the same political language, that no longer share the same media ecosystem, that increasingly self-segregate geographically and socially, It looks like a state where the formal institutions continue to function, while the informal bonds of solidarity, the shared sacrifice, the common purpose, the mutual trust steadily erode. The economic indicators suggest we're already there. When your currency markets show volatility despite fundamentally sound monetary policy, that's not an economic signal, it's a confidence signal. When your stock market rises while your population protests, that's not strength, it's bifurcation. When international institutions downgrade your credit rating, not because of your debt levels, but because of your political stability, they're telling you something.
Fitch downgraded Israel's credit rating in August 2024. The IMF's latest projections show significant downward revisions.
The OECD warns repeatedly about the need for fiscal discipline and structural reform. These institutions are diplomatic in their language, but read between the lines. They see a country whose economic trajectory depends on political choices that appear increasingly unlikely to be made. Because here's the central dilemma. The reforms needed to address these structural problems, integrating ultra-Orthodox men into the workforce and military, improving Arab educational outcomes and labor participation, reducing cost of living through deregulation and competition, containing fiscal deficits through spending discipline, all of these reforms are politically explosive. They require breaking long-standing arrangements between religious and secular, between left and right, between communities that have negotiated their terms of coexistence for decades. And they require making these changes during a war, during an economic slowdown, during a period of maximum political polarization. The current government depends on ultra-Orthodox parties for its majority. Those parties have made clear that conscription of yeshiva students is a red line. They've successfully rolled back previous attempts at integration. Meanwhile, the secular middle class that pays the taxes and serves in the military is exhausted, angry, and increasingly convinced the system is rigged against them. This is the political economy trap. The reforms most needed are the reforms most difficult to achieve, because the beneficiaries of the status quo hold veto power over change. We've seen this pattern in other countries. Italy's North-South divide, Belgium's linguistic communities, Spain's regional tensions. But those countries have the luxury of being embedded in the European Union with external constraints on their policy choices and external support in times of crisis. Israel has neither. Let me conclude with a scenario that keeps me awake at night. Imagine the war continues for another year. Direct costs approach $70 to $80 billion. The deficit remains above 5%. Growth remains anemic or negative. The shekel weakens. Inflation ticks up. Interest rates stay high. Protests grow larger and more frequent. More soldiers refuse service. More families emigrate. Brain drain from the high-tech sector accelerates as engineers and entrepreneurs look for stability elsewhere. International investment slows as geopolitical risk premiums rise. The government, needing to maintain its coalition, cannot reform the ultra-Orthodox exemptions. It cannot cut spending meaningfully because much of the spending is untouchable. Defense, debt, service, mandatory transfers. So it raises taxes on the working population. VAT goes up, income taxes rise, property taxes increase. The cost of living crisis deepens. More protests, more arrests, more polarization. The secular middle class begins to openly question why they should continue bearing a burden that others refuse. The ultra-Orthodox community, feeling attacked, becomes more insular and defensive. Arab citizens, already marginalized, see their economic opportunities shrink further. At some point, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but at some point enough people decide that the social contract is broken beyond repair. Not because they want conflict, but because they can no longer see a path to shared prosperity within the existing system. This is how democracies fracture, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small decisions by individuals and families to prioritize their own community's interests over the common good, because they no longer believe there is a common good to prioritize. The economic data suggests we're further down this path than most observers acknowledge. The protests aren't just about the hostages or the war. They're about a generation of young Israelis who look at housing prices, military service requirements, tax burdens, and political dysfunction, and ask themselves, why should I stay when the people who build your high-tech sector, who serve in your elite units, who pay the bulk of your taxes, start asking that question seriously when emigration becomes not a fringe choice, but a rational economic decision, you are in crisis. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. Israel's economic fundamentals remain strong. Its human capital is extraordinary. Its technological capabilities are world-class. Its entrepreneurial culture is unmatched. With sound policy, this economy could support a prosperous, equitable society. But economics is downstream of politics, and politics is downstream of social cohesion. When social cohesion fractures, no amount of GDP growth can substitute for the loss of collective purpose. The question isn't whether Israel will survive as a state. It almost certainly will. The question is what kind of state it will become. A prosperous democracy with shared sacrifice and mutual obligation, or a bifurcated society with a wealthy enclave increasingly detached from the struggles of everyone else, held together not by common purpose, but by fear of alternatives. The economic indicators suggest we're heading toward the latter. And once you're on that trajectory, reversing it becomes exponentially harder with each passing year. I don't offer easy solutions because there aren't any. Meaningful reform requires political consensus that doesn't exist. Crisis resolution requires leadership willing to make deeply unpopular choices. Social cohesion requires communities willing to compromise on sacred principles. What I can tell you is this: the current path is unsustainable. The fiscal arithmetic doesn't work. The demographic trends don't work. The political economy doesn't work. Something will have to give. The only question is whether it gives through managed transition or unmanaged collapse, through negotiated compromise or enforced settlement, through democratic renewal or authoritarian retrenchment. History suggests that countries in this situation rarely choose the hard reforms voluntarily. They wait until crisis forces change. They hope for external rescue. They pray for a technological breakthrough or resource discovery that solves the problem without requiring sacrifice. Sometimes they get lucky. Usually they don't. Israel's economic miracle has been built on extraordinary human capital, technological innovation, and remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. But even miracles have limits. And those limits are becoming visible in ways that should concern anyone who cares about democratic stability, regional security, or the fragility of social contracts under stress. The protesters in Tel Aviv aren't asking for revolution. They're asking for a government that represents their interests, a military strategy that makes sense, an economy that rewards work, and a society where burden and benefit are shared equitably. These are not radical demands. They are the basic expectations of democratic citizenship. The fact that 500,000 people feel compelled to take to the streets to make these demands tells you everything you need to know about how far the system has drifted from those expectations. As economists, we can model the fiscal trajectories, calculate the dependency ratios, project the growth curves, but we should never forget that behind every data point is a human decision, a family's choice, a community's cohesion or lack thereof. And right now, millions of those individual decisions are trending in a direction that should concern us all.